I have a book in my hand here that is the kind of thing that we sort of take seriously in academia, and it's a handbook for an area of knowledge. And it's the Oxford Handbook of Psychology and Spirituality, obviously very much related to our topic tonight. And what this signals something in the field of psychology and more broadly in the academic and the research community, that our faculty member, Lisa Miller, who is the editor of this, the only editor of this, and there are a number of distinguished writers that have done this, is helping to define an area of knowledge for all of humanity. Knowledge that's based on research, that's based on practice, clinical practice. And we are very proud, I'm very proud as a provost to be able to hold something like this in my hand and say that we're actually holding the flame and moving forward in this area of a very important development of self-knowledge for humanity and for ourselves.
20 years ago, 90% of people in the United States considered personal spirituality or their religion to be highly important. 90% of people. But psychology did not have much to say about how to engage the core of our spiritual life. Over the past 2 decades, psychology has come a very long way towards reaching to our patients and reaching into our scholarship to reintegrate our view of a whole person through the inclusion of spirituality. Spirituality, as you know, can be found and is found for many people through their religion or religious practice. Many people find spirituality outside of religion, in nature, through relationship. And while many definitions certainly have been given of spirituality, broadly put, it might be considered our relationship to a loving, guiding universe, our relationship in transcendence, a living two-way relationship, which distinguishes spirituality from very important correlates such as forgiveness, caring. These are very important correlates. But spirituality per se has to do with a relationship in transcendence, a relationship, which is a two-way relationship. Clinical psychology has most recently, in the past 8 years or so, come to embrace spirituality as a body of science has grown, a body of clinical science has grown, to show the centrality of spirituality in health, development, wellness, and healing. The science, alongside innovation in clinical practice, has targeted linchpins in the healing process that can inform our practice, both validate the significance of spirituality to treatment and shed light on what might not immediately be observable in the session itself per se. So science taken in tandem with innovation in clinical practice has given us a new understanding of what development and suffering really is and how we can reach through to its resolution. Those of you who practice and work directly with people, how often has someone come because they are depressed, right? Depression is the foremost reason that people come for treatment. And so we've asked from multiple perspectives, how does spirituality help in the healing process around depression, and how does spirituality help us better understand what foundationally depression really is? To understand this, we've looked not simply at the level of experience, but through multiple levels of analysis. If I were to ask you, run upstairs, and you ran quickly and your heart was pounding, what might be 3 entirely different ways to assess an increase in your heartbeat? Right? One, you'd feel it. Right? Another, you could measure it head on. And another might be to look at that which it gives off, right? Waves of blood through your pulse. So we can look at multiple levels of analysis at any question through inner knowing, through experience, through measuring it head on, and through measuring that which it gives off. 3 different ways of knowing to understand more fully what any phenomena is. In the case of examining spirituality and depression, we looked using these three methods, to ask the question, is spirituality healing of depression in the way that spirituality might ameliorate a range of struggles or medical illnesses? Is it broadly healing? Or is spirituality actually more foundationally part and parcel of depression? In other words, the voice of depression, the feeling of meaninglessness, the feeling of isolation, the question of why I exist or do I want to exist. Are these merely symptomatic of depression, or are they foundationally part of the etiology, the formation of depression? And do they need to be taken seriously, not as symptoms to go away, but as part of a growth process through which the depression will resolve? So through looking in 3 different levels of analysis, we came up with the beginning of a portrait that answers this question. We first asked people. We asked people loaded up with risk for depression. These are 30-year-olds. That's great, thanks. How personally important, great, is spirituality to you? And in using this first way of knowing, direct lived experience, we found that people for whom personal spirituality was highly important were 90% protected against a recurrence of major depression over a decade. Wow. Right? However, those very same folks, right, came into their spirituality with a 3.5 increased risk for having suffered a major depression. It was through the fire of depression, through the suffering of depression, that they came into a personal spirituality. And once established, it became 90% protective against recurrence. We then asked the question, wow, that's pretty healing. Is this a broad effect of spirituality? Does it heal everything? And it may. Or is there something about depression per se which might be better understood through closely examining the place of spirituality in its foundational constitution and etiology? So we said, let's look at another level of analysis. Having looked at experience, a correlation of 0.9, given all the mess and dirtiness of science, that sounds to me like the same thing. But let's look at another level of analysis. And so we looked in collaboration with our colleagues Brad Peterson and Myrna Weissman at the medical school. We looked at the level of the brain, concrete head-on, as in measuring your heart after you run up the stairs. And using MRI, which, as you know, uses magnetism to make an image of the brain, we looked at those regions which tend to show thinning in families with very, very high rates of depression. Those regions of the brain, particularly in the parietal lobe, in the precuneus, which are associated with thinning in families with high rates of depression and in individuals with recurrent intransigent depressions. And what we found was it was precisely in those regions where thinning's found that thickening occurred among specifically those people for whom spirituality was highly important over time. Those people who essentially used their brain to engage and practice their own spirituality over time showed thickening in these regions, the parietal lobe and precuneus, exactly where we would otherwise have thought we'd find thinning. That's the second level of analysis. And finally, we looked at what the brain gives off, energy, right? And I like these pictures because as a principle in our studies, at the end of the day, everyone, including the participants, should have had a great day. They should feel happy and edified by the experience. And so looking in this third level of analysis at what the brain gives off, we asked the question if sustained personal spirituality might be associated, although it had yet to be investigated at all in the literature, with that closest cousin that we could find, which was a sustained meditation practice. And indeed, EEG conducted on people with a sustained meditation practice shows a reading of high amplitude alpha. It's associated with inwardness, with dreaming, and certain forms of meditation while in practice. But what we found was that when we looked at people divided into 3 groups, sustained spirituality, sustained not spirituality, and people who more recently, as adults, migrated towards spirituality, what we found was that even while simply standing there with their eyes closed and resting, high amplitude alpha was identified in those people simply while asked to close your eyes, high amplitude alpha was found in those people who for years had practiced a personal spirituality. When we looked at people to bring this into the realm of depression who'd recovered from depression, the difference between groups was even more pronounced. And the reason that that's interesting to the medical community is that these readings, this high amplitude alpha among people who have recovered from depression, is exactly what you find in people who have recovered from depression through Prozac, SSRIs, as if SSRIs force the same physiology that comes through sustained personal spirituality, again lending a third level of analysis to the possibility that we're actually looking at two sides of one coin, phenomenologically, in terms of our biological substrate and in terms of etiology. So at the clinical level, at the level of MRI, and at the level of EEG, we seem to see one story. And that is the type of evidence that allows us to go now into practice and listen to the questions that are spiritual questions as more than artifactual of some other disorder, but as foundational to that which we're trying to heal, which is depression. It's an honor to be here with our fellow panelists. And I'm grateful that we'll be exploring spirituality tonight from multiple perspectives, from the experience of listening closely to a client through suffering, through transformation into healing and brightness, and through the lens of multiple investigations, which take spirituality each in its own way and its own terms. Dale Atkins is a therapist with over 25 years of experience. She is a gifted healer and clinician and an activist for children and families. She probably looks familiar because she is a public healer and has contributed to our public discourse on psychology and therapy through multiple television and radio outlets. And I'm grateful for your participation, Dale, as someone who's really been a leader in our field. Thank you.
One of the things that you just said, I would like to start off with, and it has to do with listening carefully to what people are saying and then trying to really understand whether or not they might be willing to go to a place where they feel they might like to go but are a little afraid to go. That place very, very deep within them. And sometimes they need to feel this sanctuary of an office, a space. And the office, by the way, can also be outside in nature, because I will share with you that I feel it's very important to be in a place when you're trying to do some kind of healing which has the most healing properties. So whether it's by a window, whether it's outdoors, whether it's taking a walk, whatever it is, whether it's in your office, there are places where people feel more comfortable. And I think we have to be responsive and open to other people's comfort, and don't assume that everybody's comfortable in your office because you are. I will share with you a few things that took me a lifetime to learn, and I'm still learning. And I guess that's kind of where we all are. At least I hope so. I really hope so. What you said about Prozac and meditation. There's so much research now coming out about the effects of the effects on the brain of meditation and quieting and being able to be still, and then how that translates into how we respond in our lives, how we interpret information, how we react to people. And I feel as if we're at the beginning of an unbelievable burst of energy, literally and figuratively, and information. And I think we owe it to ourselves to do what we need to do as clinicians and future clinicians and researchers to become comfortable in that space. And it's a challenge for many of us because it may not come naturally. But I believe if we really are to be able to help people find out how they can live their best lives, that we have to be able to venture into areas that are unfamiliar. And we have to take some risks personally. And that's also, in my experience, in my opinion, where sharing with someone you're working with is a whole other experience. Because if you're really open and listening, you will hear things within yourselves that you might not have been aware of. And it's important to pay attention to that and share that with colleagues and share that with supervisors and share that just in your own meditations and figure out what's really going on in you as you're trying to help someone get to be in a place of comfort. I know that you wanted me to talk about a few cases, but I'm not sure if you want me to do that now or just pass this down and come back. What's the format? Sure. I was actually, and I asked permission of the person. My background is in deafness, and it was in this university, in this college, where I got my master's in education of the deaf, as it was called in those days. And that's a whole other story about then how I came into psychology. But basically, it was because I was really involved with what is involved in listening, and what does it mean to hear, and how are people expressing themselves in ways when they really don't have, quote unquote, their voice available to them or access to ways that most people are communicating, and what happens with the frustration. And does one really need to be deaf in order not to be able to communicate? And perhaps many people who are deaf are communicating a whole lot better than those of us who have normal hearing. So I was actually, and part of my practice still is in the world of people who have hearing loss. And in the many years that I've been practicing, cochlear implants have become very common with some people who have hearing loss. And when I was first starting out, the only people who got cochlear implants were adults, and they were experimental. And now we have children being implanted as very, very young children. So, as a point of background, there is a woman who came into my office. She was referred to me by a person who's involved in the world of the deaf, and she has a 15-month-old daughter who is deaf, and it's recommended that she get a cochlear implant for her daughter. And she came in, and before she said boo to me, she said, "My daughter will hear without an implant." And I said, "Really? What makes you think so?" And she said, "I have a very strong faith that my daughter will hear. I'm a very religious person, and if I give her an implant, there's no chance that she'll be able to heal." That's how we started the session. And in the world of spirituality and psychology, not only must we listen, but we must also understand, well, what is it about this implant? What does it mean to her? What does it mean to her significant other who is very against this and wants the child to be implanted immediately because he's very afraid that she's not going to learn language quickly and will learn to speak better if she has the implant earlier on? In the world of deafness, there's some people say, well, you've got to implant a kid by the time they're 12 months old. Some will say 22 months old. Very few people are saying past 22 months old. So she said to me, "I'm willing to wait till she's 22 months old and do everything I can do between now and then. So I won't have regret, and so I will never be able to look my child in the eye when she says to me, 'Why didn't you give me a chance?'" So this, by the way, is in the first 5 minutes of the session. And over time, she has gone to many healers, and she is a person who believes very, very deeply in energy healing, in ear pulling, in all kinds of things. And she goes to healing centers, and she's a devout person. And she came into my office, 2 days ago, just before Thanksgiving, actually, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And she said, I've made my decision. And she said, and I want to thank you for your help. And I would go home thinking, how am I really helping her? What is my role with her? Because part of the time I would think, you know, do I have an obligation to tell her that if you don't give this kid an implant, there are some risks in her language and speech development? At the same time, it's not my decision. It's not my decision, it's her decision. And I have to help her and support her in this decision. And when she goes to all of these healers, I have to get into her head and her heart and try and understand what it means to her to go to all of these people and how they're helping her, and she feels they are helping her. She said that she took a test, her kid took a test, and there was an improvement in the hearing. And I said, I'd like to see the results. Would you mind sharing them with me? And we'll see them after Thanksgiving. And she said, I think there's going to be an improvement, but I decided that before her 22nd month birthday, if there isn't a significant improvement, she will have the implant, and I will feel fine about it. Now, she went through this whole arc of feelings and listening to people who told her she was crazy and that she is crazy. And she doesn't tell a lot of people about the things that she's doing because they'll say she's crazy. But she has a very strong faith that what she's doing is right for her daughter and her family. My role is not to make her feel less than. My role is to make her feel good about who she is as she's going on this journey. Now, the fact that she came to this decision for the 22 months made me breathe a little easier, because I know I would have probably talked to her about my needing to be somewhat of an advocate and talked to her a little bit more about what the risks were for her child. But it wasn't really my role initially. And I think that for me, and I've been in the world of deafness for a long time, for me, when I first started out and people were going to faith healers, I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand it. I was resistant to it. And there were so many people who would poo-poo it and say, well, you know, they're just denying the fact that their kid is deaf, or they're denying the fact of this or that. And it's only denial, and they can't deal with it. They have to accept it. Coming to terms with something takes a while, a long while. And people need to go through what they need to go through in order to get there. And I think that my role over these years is to try and make that journey, which is so uncomfortable at times, and so threatening, and so risky, to be as safe as possible. And it's not always easy. It's not always easy for them, and it's not always easy for me. But it is always, always something that I'm learning about them, the journey, the process, my journey, and understanding that someone else's spiritual life in some ways defines them. And if it defines them, we have to know that about them. And we have to make a space where they can tell us and feel comfortable telling us and not feel criticized. Because that's where the healing begins, when they're fully accepted with who they are. So perhaps I'll stop there for the moment.
John Allegrante is the Deputy Provost of Teachers College, as well as a Senior Professor of Health Education and a very distinguished scientist. He's had 2 decades of NIH funding and has had major innovation with strong implications for practice on health-related behavior change. Dr. Allegrante.
I want to say this to start. You're the best audience I've ever seen. You look great. I'm doing that for a specific reason that relates to my talk in a moment. But I want to give you a little context, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about over the next 8 or 10 minutes here or so. First of all, I have a confession to make. I am not a psychologist. Horrors. I'm an applied behavioral scientist who has been at the college for 33 years. came here when I was 15. And over the 20 of those years, I've had a series of NIH grants with colleagues at various institutions, but most specifically at Cornell and here at Columbia. And we've been pursuing a series of studies that have evolved over time. My interest has been coping, communication, and control in the clinical practice arena. And two of the things that Dale just said, I think I can ramp off of. One was this idea of listening, clinicians listening to their patients. And I thought it was profound that you also said that you want to have them feel good, ultimately, after meeting with you. And that's really the topic in some ways of my presentation tonight. I'm not going to be talking about the connections with respect to spirituality and health. I'm going to provide some empirical data because I'm a pragmatic scientist. And I'm going to talk about the connections and show you some data to reinforce the idea that there are these mind-body relationships that are becoming increasingly more important in our lives, and particularly in the practice of clinical medicine, and I would argue clinical psychotherapy and other treatment modalities. I want to start with this slide, well, that one right there. And the background to all of this is that if you remember back to the early and mid-2000s, there was a lot of popular interest in something called positive psychology. It began with Time magazine publishing an entire issue devoted to happiness and positive psychology, and the progenitor of this work on the scientific and academic side has been Martin Seligman, who's been at the University of Pennsylvania over the years and now has a center there that is looking at positive psychology. We became very interested in the implications of positive emotion, positive affect in particular, and positive psychology as we began to look at the failures that we were seeing in clinical research that has sought for over 25 years to improve adherence among people who have to take medicines, to help people to exercise, to help people to lose weight. You name the health-related behavior, and I can point to a number of failures to really help and facilitate people to make these changes. And so when we looked at particular groups of patients, such as heart disease patients, we typically found that most of the work that had been done, most of the studies that had been conducted had been concerned about negative aspects: stress, anger, depression, negativity. And so in the context of seeing that perhaps we were not working in the right area with respect to these kinds of negative emotions, we began to turn our attention to the side of positive emotions, which was coinciding with the popular interest and the growing scientific interest in the connections between positive behaviors, positive affect, and pro-social behaviors and the kinds of outcomes that I think most societies are interested in trying to achieve. This quote sort of, I think, speaks to it. A merry heart doeth good like it medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. So that sort of gives some insight into what I'm speaking about here. Next slide. So to begin with, this is a very simple presentation of the conceptual model off of which we're working. And I think this is from Pressman. I can't see is that Luber-Mariski or yeah. So this is a conceptual model from, I think, Ed Diener and Luber-Mariski's group that effectively shows that positive affect and positive emotions results in successful behavioral outcomes. It's not entirely clear whether, if you're successful, you're likely to be more positive, or whether if you're positive, you're likely to be more successful. I think it's probably a little bit of both. But if you look at the literature about positive emotions and positive affect, you find the literature being replete with studies that show that people who are positive get better outcomes. They do better at relationships, they do better at work, And we think, and we have some data that suggests that they may live longer and have higher quality of life. So positive emotion is really important here. Next slide. So what about the mechanism, you might ask? If that's the conceptual model that positive emotions produces prosocial and other kinds of positive outcomes in life, what's the mechanism? And this is, I think this is Pressman's work here. There are two models I'll show you. This is a direct effects model that suggests that positive affect as a positive emotional state. And, I don't have time tonight to talk about trait versus state. There's a lot of data to show that people who are positive as a trait, something that's on the gene, actually do have better chance of living longer. We have been largely interested in trying to modify a state to help people, even when they're not very positive, to be positive on a daily basis, because we think it can improve their receptivity to information and produce other benefits that are of interest to us in the clinical setting in terms of their behavior changes. But this direct effects model suggests that positive affect affects everything from the opioids that are naturally occurring, such as endorphin, for example, and works through the central autonomic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary axis that is important in modulating our immune system, but also through our social ties and our various health practices. So again, the direct model is that if you have positive affect, you're going to do well or better across all of these pathways, if you will, to disease prevention, which is essentially moderated by our immune system. The second, next slide shows a different model or a different mechanism by which it's been posited that positive affect can influence disease outcomes and health outcomes. And that is to suggest that positive affect is a buffer, if you will, against stressful life events. I mean, every day we're buffeted on a daily basis, where there are all these perturbations in our life on a daily basis. We missed the bus. I wait at the bridge for an hour when I hope to get to a meeting at 10 a.m. So positive affect, being positive, may help us to buffer the effects of those stress in a couple of ways. It may simply enable us to be positive in the face of these perturbations and these things that disturb us. Or it may help in the sense that our positive affect toward other people gives us more resources on which we can draw to provide social support at times of distress. And I think we've probably seen the power of that just recently in response to the hurricane. But again, same mechanisms in terms of health outcomes and disease prevention. So with that understanding, what we've done over the last several years, we had a grant from the National Institutes of Health, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and we conducted a very large set of trials that involved a group of asthma patients, a group of hypertension patients, and a group of patients shown here who were randomized to a controlled trial where we looked at physical activity in response to what we were doing in the approach to helping people to be more physically active. This happened to be a group of patients who had cardiovascular disease, that had undergone angioplasty. This is the report that came out earlier this year, published by our group with Janie Peterson, a doctoral student of mine, a graduate of Teachers College in Health Education, and the rest of our team. What's important about this is that in all three trials, we developed a behavioral intervention approach that we believed would be the single most potent approach we could to helping people change. So we went to the practice-based literature, we went to the evidence base, and designed the single best intervention to help people adhere to their recommendations by their physician, in this case, exercise. And the only thing that we did differently between the intervention group, the experimental test group, and the comparison or control group was we added something called positive affect and self-affirmation. We, on a daily basis, we had a workbook we gave both sets of patients, and in the one workbook there was a chapter about being positive and about how to be positive on a daily basis, thinking positive thoughts, thinking about things that made you happy, And for most people, it is often family, important accomplishments, those kinds of things. And we had elements also from the work of Claude Steele, who's a former provost here at Columbia, a psychologist at Stanford, who's worked with the problem of stereotype threat, and he's worked with a concept called self-affirmation. So we are simply helping people on a daily basis try to be positive, to induce their own positive affect, and to self-affirm themselves by remembering important accomplishments on a daily basis. And we taught people how to do this. We gave them the workbook where it was described to maintain that. And the next slide shows, and this is only one bit of data from this, chart or graph charts the number of kilocalories expended on a weekly basis over a 12-month period of time during which we followed these patients. And if you can see it on one of these monitors, you can see the control group, which I think is the dotted line, starts out over the first few months of the intervention. So they were doing pretty well too. Remember, we had a very powerful, very robust intervention. It wasn't designed to be some, attention control placebo or, straw man to be knocked down. It was a very strong control behavioral intervention. But the addition of positive affect as an interventional component, along with the self-affirmation, allowed by 6 months, as you can see, and at the end of the 12-month study period during which we were following these patients, it allowed us to demonstrate that these people were able to walk much further on a weekly basis. They burned more kilocalories on a weekly basis. So positive affect inductions helped this group, we think, with this particularly important behavior in this group of patients. The second study that I'll show you is not related to the first set of studies I described, but is a more recent report that we just published in Preventive Medicine. And this is an interesting study to me because it, again, speaks to the connections between mind and body, but it also is a tale of caution in the sense that the more we engage in our own individual personal health moralities, if you will, and become deeply engaged in bodybuilding or running or any of these things that in general we think are positive for human health, there are potentially downsides. And in this particular study, a visiting scholar from Korea spent the year with us last year, and she worked with both Carol Garber and myself. And we had been talking about the potentially negative impact of being involved in physical activity. Now, I'm not talking about sports injury and those kinds of negative impacts, but the sort of the preoccupation with one's body and the preoccupation with exercising all of the time. So to answer this question, we looked at data from the National Health Information Trend Study, HINTS, 2008 data, about 7,000 randomly selected national respondents, and essentially looked at the mental health symptom experience they reported in relation to the number of hours per week of physical activity they were getting. And I'll show you just quickly here what this graph shows you is, I think, a pretty interesting finding. I can remember when we first saw the finding, my colleagues wanted to send it to some obscure physiology journal. I said, no, I think we should send that to the Journal of the American Medical Association. This has real implications for population health in terms of helping people to understand the role of activity. So what this shows you is that if you graph the number of hours of physical activity with mental health symptoms, essentially, and this is not depression. These are self-reported symptoms of difficulty with mental health. You find that there's a sweet spot, if you will, that's drawn by the little dotted oval on the schematic. It's down toward the 2.5 hours to 7.5 hours portion of the curve there. And you can see that if you get something less than 2 hours a week of physical activity, and that's essentially the basic federal guideline in terms of how much physical activity. I'm not talking about running and marathoning. I'm talking about simply walking and moving, if you will. If you do the minimum, you get fairly good response up until about 7.5 hours a week. And beyond that, you don't get the same response. You don't get any lesser reporting of mental health symptoms. So this is a striking finding, and it does suggest, again, there are relationships between mind and body. Sometimes what we prescribe can perhaps not be a good thing, depending on how often you're engaged in it. And I would submit that these are the kinds of findings that I think are of great value in what we do in public health and population health in the work that we're doing now. So the last slide, I'll just tell you that if you can't see the caption, it says, "I like it." It says, "Tenured, but still publishing." Thank you very much.
Professor Suniya Luthar is professor of clinical psychology and developmental psychology, a graduate of Yale, where she earned her doctorate, and multiple NIH grants. She has essentially created a field around resilience and thriving in young people, and we have many discussions about what is spirituality in the second person in our relations to one another. And you're a great visionary around this, and I look forward to your sharing your work with us.
I'm focusing on where is the need for us as psychologists to be attentive to the lack of spirituality, if there is such a thing, a group, a population, and as you will see, I will tell you, there is such a group and potentially big implications of their lack of access to all the gifts that spirituality potentially has to offer. Who is this group? Affluent kids. When I say affluent, I am not talking about .com millionaires. I'm talking about my children. I'm talking about your children, children of doctors, lawyers, and professors, upper middle class, white collar professionals. Why am I looking at them? Like it or not, many of them are going to be leaders in various fields, education, business, politics, what have you. The other reason I said is, and you will see the data here, we stumbled upon findings about their profiles that beyond their dazzling resumes and their achievement levels and what have you, that underlying all of this often was a great deal of distress. Data. I'm just going to briefly share with you maybe 3 or 4 slides with the data. This is percent of adolescents drunk in the past month. The orange bar here is national norms. This is huge national normative sample. This here is East Coast suburban youth, and this is girls and boys. These are students in a private school in a large city. Very exclusive private school. I don't need to tell you, can see it, 3, 4, 5 times as high percentages of getting drunk. Similar data with marijuana use, similar data with hard drug use and use of prescription drugs and ecstasy is soaring. What about distress? Anxious, depressed, withdrawn, depressed, somatic complaints, phobia, and so on. Again, blue is our, in this case, it's not East Coast. For a while there, I thought maybe it's just us East Coast people. Right? So off we went, and this is Northwest, a suburban community in the Northwest. Same patterns again. The orange line will tell you where national norms are. This is percentage of kids who have symptoms that are significantly elevated. It's not just having the blahs, but having really a significant level of symptoms in terms of numbers. This is where norms fall. This is where the girls fell and boys are anxious, depressed, and so on. But this is what has really captured my attention over time. The bar here I'm referring to, 2 columns are rule breaking, random acts of delinquency. What we found is that you might think that, well, stereotypes will tell you, it's the inner city kids who are delinquent and who go breaking into things when there's no need to. In our comparisons of our kids with kids in bleak poverty, we found comparable overall levels of delinquency with one big difference. The inner city kids do things like carrying a weapon or get into a fight, which could be potentially to protect themselves, right? Survival. Our kids, as I said, random acts. Stealing from mom, stealing from a friend, defacing property, so on and so forth. This finding has been troubling me a great deal, not just the substance use, but the rule breaking, which we're seeing over and over again, regardless of East Coast, West Coast, public schools, private schools, suburbs, or city. We're seeing it over and over again. Envy. Again, people would think people without money are envious, right? These are our kids, particularly our daughters. This is envy of peers. If your friends do better academically than you do, if they're prettier, more attractive than you are, if they're better at sports, if they're more popular, or if they have more money. Of course, these are all skills. I'm simplifying the presentations for you. These are the inner city kids. The dotted lines, and the solid lines are our kids. Envy is uniformly higher among upper middle class children in white collar families than it is among inner city kids who are stereotyped as being envious. I haven't got those data on these slides, but we've also found the same thing on extracurricular activities. Our kids do much more on sports and on performing arts and on academics. Civic activities such as going to temple, charity work, and so on, it's the inner city kids who are higher. So our findings essentially are, and one of my doctoral students and I just published this paper reviewing, again, multiple cohorts. We're seeing the patterns over and over again. Our children are showing there's a typo there, very high disturbance compared to the average American team and compared to their inner city counterparts. So the question is, why? How can we help? What's going wrong when the kids are not doing well? What's going right when the kids are doing well? Because not all these kids, God forbid, not everybody is troubled, right? There's a range. What I'm telling you is that we've got a disproportionately large number of kids in our families who are very troubled. Remember, I talked about percentages. 7% in the average American population, and among our kids, more like 20%, 25%. You with me? So the question is, what are the risk factors? What characterizes those 20, 25%? And one of our big findings is it's a tendency toward to be oriented more toward what are called extrinsic goals. I want to be rich. I want to be famous. I want to be popular. I want to be admired by many, as opposed to intrinsic goals, generosity, kindness, respect for others in need. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, all of us want all of the above, right? To some degree. We all want to be somewhat, at least comfortable, respected, admired. What we look at is sort of a ratio or a difference between the two. So where does the balance fall? Are you more extrinsic compared to intrinsic, or are you closer? And what we're finding is that among our kids, those who are disproportionately on the extrinsic, willing to let the intrinsic stuff fall by the wayside, who are more into fame and money and wealth and popularity and saying, helping and kindness and generosity is all good and dandy, but not quite as important. These are the children who are sometimes most at risk for the kinds of difficulties I showed you. What are the protective factors? What keeps our kids grounded? Our grandmothers could have told us this. They probably did. It's intuitive. A good relationship with parents. Not just a good relationship, and we've established this with our data, when mothers and fathers say, let me rephrase that. When kids say, I believe that my mom and dad, above all, want me to be a good, kind, respectful, decent human being. Second is, make money and be famous and whatnot. That is hugely protective. Not just for their personal adjustment, depression, anxiety, substance use, but guess what? Also for their academic grades. So paradoxically, when kids feel like their parents are pushing, get ahead, get ahead, get ahead, get ahead, get ahead, it not only is associated with more depression, anxiety, and substance use, but it's also associated with lower academic performance. So having parents who value and also obviously model it, do as I do, not as I say, right, is very important. Of particular importance is relationships with mothers. Now, believe me, I'm not by any means saying that fathers are not important. What tends to happen in a lot of these families is fathers work very, very long hours and are not around quite as much in terms of spending one-on-one time with the children. They are very important, but when you look at in what is called multivariate analyses, partialing out for unique associations, again and again and again, it comes out. The quality of relationships with moms is very important. This is not about mom bashing. I'm a mother. I have a 22-year-old, almost, he'll be 22 next week, and an 18-year-old. I know what it's like. It's a hard job. And I know that the kids respond. And I know they react. So for anyone who says, does this mean that the father is not important? Obviously not. But the bottom line is, what our data are showing us over and over again is, if you want to prioritize and come down with one or two, the top thing, what do we go to? We're seeing it over, even for these, as I said, successful, college-bound, big, tall, handsome, attractive, beautiful, accomplished young women, whatever, even they're saying, when I feel alienated from mom, when I feel like mom doesn't get me, when I feel criticized, and I don't feel close, or I feel like mom's value system is just do more. She just wants me to accomplish more. It hurts. There's no way around it. So then, how are we doing? If you think causally, right? If I'm telling you, all right, our kids are not happy, and their happiness seems to be related to our happiness, question is, how are we doing? There's been more and more now in the media about women, mothers like myself. This is Judy Warner's book, which was probably about now, it's probably a decade old now or so, but there's been many more since with the same theme, that essentially that we are not fulfilled or feel enormously gratified. To the contrary, there's angst and a sense of self-doubt and guilt and conflict. This is according to her own experiences, her research, whatever experience she did. But my task was, all right, we're seeing it in our kids. We're seeing it particularly in our daughters. Could there potentially be something going on in us, the mothers, that might be mirroring or mirrored by what we're seeing in our children? So we did this large study. We're actually in the process of writing it up, maybe 3,000-4,000 women, mothers, across socioeconomic groups, but oversampling for women who with college degrees and graduate degrees. Money does not mean happiness by any means. We are not only are we not necessarily doing better than our less educated counterparts, but oftentimes we're actually more stressed, more unhappy, more, you know what that means.
Round up.
Thank you. Well, then again, think causally. Kids to mothers, mothers to, all right, so how do I function well? If my children's groundedness is tied to me, how do I dole it out? What helps me be a decent, good enough mother, to use Winnicott's term? And I'm just going to give you this one finally. This is subjective well-being, anxiety, depression, feelings of emptiness. After all I've done, I still look around and I feel like life feels empty, right? And feelings of stress. Across all of these, there's a one-item question. Do you feel seen and loved for the person you are at your core? I believe psychologists call it unconditional love. Guess what? Mothers need it too. We are charged with the task of doing this for our children. And God knows we try our hardest, but it is a difficult job. And trying to dole out this kind of, the combination of, obviously the love and affection, but the limit setting, the priorities, the don't go nuts about. If you don't get into Yale, sweetheart, you'll get an education. It's not the end of the world, right? Trying to keep your balance, living in that, what I call the culture of affluence. It's a hyper-competitive, and I'm not putting anybody down, least of all myself or my kids, right? But we do. There are pressures, just like there are pressures in poverty, of violence, of gangs, what have you, we have a different set, but very potent set of risk factors in our subculture, which we are only just beginning to recognize. So this is what I'm coming to now, is saying, trying to understand what it is that helps mothers, parents, the primary caregivers do well. And in doing this work, when Lisa and I talked about this and what is spirituality and how does this connect with, I use the old-fashioned term love, which psychologists don't often use. We have nice fancy words like support and intimacy and such, but love is too loosey-goosey or something. When I was talking to Lisa, I was thinking about Bodhisattva. I'm thinking about, this is from Buddhism, right? There's 10 states. This is the highest state. A state of devotion to alleviating others' suffering. Same thing about Bodhisattva. Of these 10 states, if you're trying to achieve that state, this is always hindered if you are in these lower states of suffering, despair, and anger. Makes common sense, right? How can I be helpful and kind and generous to you if I'm in pain myself? Yes? So if we, as caregivers, and I don't mean just mothers, I mean us as teachers, as gurus, as educators, anyone who is charged with, who has the responsibility for seeing this child, this young person develop from infancy onwards, and they don't stop. In high school, they don't stop. As I keep emphasizing, there are 18-year-olds who are brash and confident and look so self-assured. Inside, so many of them are crumbling. Point is, for those of us who are charged with helping these children thrive, how can we do it if we're not fed ourselves? And given our data, we're showing that so many mothers, women like myself, and like many of you in this room, are not feeling, are hindered too much by suffering, aloneness, despair, and not feeling that unconditional love. Do you feel seen and loved for the person you are at your core? So that's where my road is taking me right now, working on this book, Who Mothers Mommy? If moms have to do it, where are they going to get the strength from? How do we make that happen? And we must, not just for the sake of our young people who are going to be the future leaders, who are going to change, hopefully, our value systems in a more positive direction, are going to value generosity, humanity, the greater good. Not just for them, but for heaven's sake, for us too. We matter. We're not dead yet. Thank you.
How do you make someone else a positive person?
I'm not sure if I have the answer to it. If you read what the positive psychology psychologists and scientists are saying about positive affect, I think there's a general sense that it is something that can be learned. Again, there's the idea of some people possess the trait. They're hopelessly positive. And others who don't possess the trait can certainly learn the skills and learn the value of being positive as a state. We use a very simple approach to this. We also gave people small gifts of delight value to show that we were interested in them. And my whole notion of saying you were a terrific looking audience tonight was to induce positive affect, in part because I wanted you to, I wanted to draw you in, and I wanted literally to have you lean forward and perhaps be more receptive to what I might have to say. And that's the power of this that we're finding. But, you know, I think it's a skill that perhaps people can learn.
Just finished writing a paper with another of my doctoral students looking at the field of resilience and positive psychology and the commonalities and differences. And in our business, resilience, why do children thrive in the face of adversity? I firmly believe, as the science shows, resilience rests ultimately on relationships. And guess what? We're finding the same thing in positive psych. I think it was Peterson who said, other people matter. So when you talk about hope or optimism or a sunny outlook and so on, all of these things are engendered, we're again back to the old-fashioned Love. If we feel loved, it brings forth good things.
Yeah, just on that point, you know, I've been delighted to listen to, you know, essentially clinicians who are engaged in psychotherapeutic practice talk about the treatment of clients and people with whom they're working. And the one thing that I've heard consistently from clinicians in the medical environment, and more importantly patients, is this problem of trust. I'm convinced that many clinicians do not achieve the kinds of clinical outcomes that their administrations and their treatment could provide because their patients don't trust them, and in effect don't love them in a sense, if you will, and they sense that. So I think you're right.
The guardedness, yeah.
Yeah.
May I add something to that point? First of all, thank you for bringing it up. I think that there's something, when I was in training a long, long time ago, you never shared anything about yourself. There was nothing that you could ever, you weren't like a human being. And if you're someone who has empathy and wants to really engage with a person, it's a very, very difficult thing to assume. And it really, there's a lot of literature that says why this is important. But after so many years sitting in the chair where I often sit, I find, to the point of trust, to the point of being human, that after enough experience, you can see where you might be getting into deep water, and you can take responsibility for that. But when you're really in the pool with the person, so much can happen. And you have to be yourself. We're trying so hard to help people find out who they are. We need to be who we are in that space and engender this comfort and security and trust. And I also want to speak to your question, if I may, just from my experience. And I believe in my whole heart that this can be learned, that people can learn to have, and they do have, a shift in the positive affect, and their brains show it on MRI. The issue is, how long does it take? There are many who believe it takes at least 21 days, and then after you do 21 days, you are then having this habit, and you're more likely to continue doing something, whether it's writing down 3 things that you're very grateful for at the end of each day, and engaging with that, and thinking about yourself and why you're grateful for those things. And they can be very small things, whether it's doing random acts of kindness for people, holding the door and making eye contact, and really engaging with the relationship, with the person, with a stranger, but someone who acknowledges your presence in this world and you're doing something for them. So that, again, the issue of relationship, it doesn't have to only be how you get along with your mother, which is very nice, but it's how do you deal with the person sitting next to you on the bus? How are you acknowledging one another? If you're sitting in an airport, I will share with you one of my big disappointments in the world. I love to fly and I love to travel, and I used to talk to people in the airport, and I used to talk to people who sat next to me. Now everybody's on their BlackBerries or got their earphones on, and you can go from point A to point B and never know the name of the person next to you, where they're going, what a great restaurant is in the town you're going to because they live there. It's a whole different realm, and people feel more isolated. So the training part is, how can we change the brain? How can we engage where we feel we are known and noticed and acknowledged and valued? And that can be learned, because so many of us didn't learn it as children. And I think that's an issue. So thank you for letting me participate in that.
In the medical care of many teens, one often comes across teenage negativism, which is when you hear a lot of reasons as to why this or that won't work. And I find it helpful to say, maybe, but maybe not, so that I'm acknowledging their feeling, but opening the door a little bit for other opportunities.
My question to the clinicians is primarily, there's a flip side to this, right? There's spiritual bypassing. And I'm curious as to if any of you have ever encountered that, and how would you offer any advice to us to navigate when we encounter that type of dynamic. Spiritual bypassing primarily is when you tend to avoid the personal, the very personal or what's going on in the tangible, and tend to always spiritualize or want to go beyond the farther reaches of what is going on right here, specifically in culture as well. So I'm curious if you've ever encountered that in any of your practices.
You know, I think the way that I could answer that is, and I'm not sure that until more recently I've seen this within the world of spirituality, but certainly you're talking about, if I'm correct, you're talking about avoiding self and moving only into the spiritual reality, correct? Right.
So going straight to the trend
Yes.
and avoiding the personal.
Right.
And
You
I
don't.
think about issues like culture and social issues that have to be addressed on a very personal level. And people that are very religious or very spiritual
Yes.
tend to go on to spiritualize everything and go to that level. And how do we balance that?
You know, in the field of psychology and the work of psychotherapy, one would say to help the person who is living only in the spiritual, maybe it's cultural, societal, or only in the religious, to also get in touch with the self, whether that was a defensive move psychodynamically or it's part of your culture. It is critical that the spiritual life, the religious life, is attached to your sense of self, and that's clearly being missed in what you call the bypassing. So that would be my best way to approach that.
Health is integration and disintegration is unhealth. And I think your point is excellent. We have our relationship to ourselves, towards one another, and to the ultimate universe, and all integrated create a wholeness within us. I can share with you stories. For instance, I know a Buddhist nun who went for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days into isolation. And in that process had very powerful, I would say very real, transcendental experiences. And yet, when she came out, her unfinished work at the I-thou level, the interpersonal, and at the level of objects relations, didn't provide sufficient ego strength to hold that transcendental experience. And it was misinterpreted at the ego level, at a narcissistic level, and caused great suffering for her, right? So it is an extremely important point, and all dimensions are equally important to be integrated in our wholeness.
I agree with both of your comments, and I would. Your question also said to me, what advice do we have for you, being the clinician? I understand. Again, it comes down to safety, and to understand that what would happen to me if I came out of that living in that spiritual realm? What's the risk for me? How do I put my toe in the water? And are you going to be there with me so I won't drown? And I think, again, it's listening, it's allowing someone to be safe and to say, this has worked for you for a long time, and you've been able to do this, this, and this. And I would do it very positively, but say, but you're here for a reason. What seems to be missing? What's troubling you? And I think people generally know. They just have to feel safe enough to be able to express it in a way where they're not going to feel judged. I think the issue is too much of anything.
Exactly.
Yes.
And if you are so involved in whatever it is, then I think, for me, it's all about balance. So can there be too much yoga? Yeah, if you're doing yoga all the time, and you may be feeling really good, but just to your point about the nun, I think that we have to live a life. And exactly. So, yeah, I think there can be too much of whatever. And the question really is, I think for all of us, is to find what is enough. Good enough mom, good enough whatever.
Right.
What's
Good
enough?
enough grades.
Exactly.
Good enough achievement.
What's enough yoga? For me to feel the benefits of yoga And to be able to take that with me, integrate the breathing, feel centered,
Right.
feel focused, and not feel that I have to do more in order to be more. And that's the question that disturbs me. When we can accomplish something, but then it doesn't seem to be enough,
That's right,
because it's never enough. So what's enough?
right.
And for me, maybe 5 hours of yoga is enough. For you, maybe 50 hours of yoga is enough. I mean, I don't know, but I do think that there is enough. First of all, I do not see myself as a guru. Second of all, I hope and pray to God that I know my limitations. I'm a big referrer. Having said that, I do feel comfortable with certain techniques that I feel it's interesting, now are almost mainstream. I mean, we talk about meditation. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the only people who I knew who meditated were people who went to yoga retreats and monks and people who were very, very religious, and they would do meditation. And maybe 30 years ago. Over the last 30 years, people are meditating, people are quieting, people are talking about mindfulness.
Right.
And there are programs galore where people can engage in these practices as well as learning them. Now, I think that, I often will ask someone to try and take or become involved in a meditation practice, take a class, participate in a program with someone who really is a teacher. And I think that to help someone breathe as they're involved in a session, to help someone learn techniques, I feel comfortable doing that. I do not feel comfortable becoming a religious teacher because I'm not. And I think that I always actually feel for my colleagues, I have many colleagues who are religious people, who are priests and rabbis and ministers who are also psychologists. And they need to have a very keen awareness whether they're doing psychology or whether they're doing pastoral work, because it's really different. And sometimes I know somebody who has two different offices. One office is in a temple and one office is on the main street in a professional building. Because when he's a rabbi, and when he's a psychologist, he's a psychologist. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I think we all have to know where we are and keep going on our journey, but we have to know what we're capable of and where our limitations are, and that we can't be everything to everybody, and we're not serving them. When we're not serving the people who come to see us and ask our help, if we're not giving our best and most learned and most practiced self. That's my opinion about it.
But that spirituality is really a felt sense. It's an inner felt sense. So it's not really so much about religion as the sensory experience or that everyone has, or that we don't always know how to access. And so the somatic piece can be really helpful in that, very powerful, to work through the body, not just on the cognitive, in the cognitive domain.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. Have a great night.
Thank you very much.